Every religious tradition shares commonalities in their mythology, whether it's creation, catastrophe, such as a flood, or the ultimate end of the world. Now, I don't mean mythology in the sense that they're all made up or invented stories, but rather that these ancient narratives speak to a deeper truth about the human experience. The fears that virtually all humans have shared for as far back as we can trace. How different groups view topics such as the creation or the end, however, seems to vary dramatically. Or do they? Charles Shirō Inouye, professor of Japanese at Tufts University, has a unique insight into the convergences between what we often distinguish as Eastern and Western thought. Being raised as a Mormon by traditionally Buddhist parents, Charles has a rare insight into how distinctions between Eastern and Western ideas break down in many ways. In his new book, The End of the World, Plan B, he traces the idea of the end, or the destruction of the world, through the Abrahamic traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, as well as Buddhism. What he shows is that our modern understanding of the endgame has been distorted by a demand on justice as the ultimate good. In one passage, he writes, "Narrative violence has been a part of the human experience for a very long time. The Bible is filled with war and murder. The Quran similarly speaks of harsh judgment and destruction. The Book of Mormon is about, among other things, unstoppable genocide. But maybe our deepest sense of the end of the world comes from what we observe on a daily basis. Plants flourish and decline, so do animals. Things wear out. Wood rots and burns. Metals rust and decay. People die. Nothing lasts forever. Yet, we notice a renewal. Babies and children teach us about birth and growth, as do the plants and animals around us." Charles believes that our fixation on justice is self-destructive, and he offers an alternative, a plan B, where the end of the world, rather than cataclysmic, is transformative, where death, destruction, and entropy are part of a larger cycle, and how sorrow, compassion, and peace, embodied in all of these traditions, are the means by which the world can be transformed. Maybe it is the end of the world, but maybe that isn't something to be feared. Charles, thank you for coming on to the podcast today.
My pleasure. Yeah.
Why don't we go ahead and start with a little bit on your background and how you became interested in studying the end times narratives?
Well, I grew up in southern Utah, a little town called Sigurd, and I was my parents were Buddhists, but they wanted us to have some sort of spiritual training, so they sent us to the Mormon church in Sigurd, and we all became Latter-day Saints, and so we grew up thinking about things like the last dispensation and the fullness of times and the return of Jesus, the second coming. So there's that. Also, I study Japanese culture, and a lot of apocalyptic themes appear in post-war Japanese culture. Gojira, for example, the animated film Akira, which begins after the destruction of most of Tokyo. Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World. That's a novel by Murakami Haruki. So there are many things that point in that direction. And then I guess the third thing is that current events are such that make us aware of the increasingly relevant topic of the end of the world, global warming. I do a lot of fishing, so I've noticed that not only the numbers of fish, but the populations of fish on the East Coast have changed over time. And then finally, there's the instability and war in the Middle East and other places that have us thinking about the possibility of the end of the world. So that's how I kind of started into the idea.
Tell me a little bit about your experiences growing up in, I guess you can say, somewhat of a blended faith family, as far as traditions are concerned. How did this inform you growing up, and what traditions did your family hold on to that were Buddhist as well as Latter-day Saint?
My parents were farmers. They ended up there because of relocation. They were both living on the West Coast when Pearl Harbor occurred, and for different reasons, they ended up in the same camp in Heart Mountain, and then from there came south and settled near Sigurd in a farmhouse a couple miles just west of the city, of the town. And home was Japanese, but the world outside was Mormon, actually. And so I grew up in those two worlds. I remember one moment when my grandfather took me into his bedroom and put a chair in front of the dresser and stood me on it and had me stand in front of the Buddhist altar that he had there on top of his dresser. And he put a rosary on my hands. He rung a little brass bell, and he lit incense, and he had me pray to this altar. And that sort of thing happened alongside of going to Sunday school every Sunday and going to sacrament meeting. It was, in some sense, I guess, a confusing mix, but I later learned that one of the reasons my parents probably allowed us to go to the Mormon church was because there are actually many similarities between Pure Land Buddhism, Jodo Shinshu, which was the sect that we belonged to, and Mormonism, actually.
Give us a little comparison between Eastern and Western thoughts on the idea of end times.
I'm not sure we can easily separate Eastern and Western thought from each other, but I understand the value of making those comparisons. I think if there is one interesting difference to talk about, it would be that a lot of the Eastern traditions think of the end of the world more as a lowercase event, E-V-E-N-T, rather than an uppercase E-V-E-N-T, which is to say that the teaching is more about the daily practice of spiritual enlightenment and the way that we move toward a relationship with the truth. The Buddhists believe that, for example, the idea of mappo, or the end of the law, is such that already by the year 1000, it was impossible for a person to save himself by his or her own efforts, or what they call jiriki, or your own effort. And it made the need for the efforts of another, or tariki, necessary. And so you begin to see figures of salvation enter the picture, Amida and Kannon and Jizo and so on. But the moment is more, the important moment in Buddhism is the not the momentous, but the quotidian, the daily moment of practice. Compare that to, Judaism and the notion among some, not all, but among especially the Kabbalistic strain of Jewish thought, that there will be a savior, a Messiah who will come and visit the world, and at that time there will be a transformation of the world. The Muslims also believe in a day of judgment that comes toward the end for all. They also, interestingly, believe in various signs of the times that will signal the end. One of them being the building of tall buildings, for example. And then, as you probably know, Christianity also has this idea of the second coming, Armageddon, apocalypse. But apocalypse is probably in a way misunderstood by many Christians as a time of destruction, when the sort of the real meaning of the term is a revelation of all truth. So yeah, on those two, big E or little e, I think there's quite a difference of understanding.
So it sounds like you're saying that there's probably more commonalities between Eastern and Western thought than there are differences.
I think so. I think it's a very common notion. And what I tried to do in the book is to, ask the question, well, where does this idea come from? And then to trace it to these various spiritual traditions. I didn't really look at the Hindu tradition. That's one of the ones that I didn't look into, but I did look into Buddhism and Christianity and Islam and so forth. Yeah.
So one of the things that I've been, pondering on is the teleological nature of the Christian view of the end times. In fact, it seems like that's the idea of the second coming is really what gave us this linear idea of how time works for many Christians. And that didn't seem to be the case for a lot of other cultures. That some cultures seem to have a little more of a cyclical view of these things, that things somewhat unfold in a cyclical fashion. Is there any evidence that this is coming into play in the research that you've done on Eastern thought?
Yeah, I think, Brian, that when you look at even the Christian and even the Mormon view of the end, that the linearity, as you call it, the teleological force of the narrative is actually it might actually be the result of our modern reading of those teachings. Modernity being a very linear process of improvement, of working toward certain goals and so on. And I think that is actually a big part of the way that everybody who is modern, to whatever extent, understands these teachings. So if you think about ISIS, for example, their use of Islam is modern in the sense that they latch on to this notion of a future calamity, and they make that a part of their political agenda. And I think that is actually not uncommon. In the book, I use the example of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's famous poem about the Civil War, and how he references the moment when the angels declare the birth of Jesus as a time of peace. But he also says that it's also a time when the right will prevail and the wrong will fail. And I think that addition of the right and wrongness of the victorious, righteous side of a war is in fact a modern reading of this ancient paradigm. But the paradigm itself, I think, is moving us toward a certain attitude about the destruction of other people. And I think that if you look at those teachings in comparison with the Buddhist notion of leaving the burning house, so that's what they call this reality, and moving up toward enlightenment and then moving back toward the burning house to save those who are left.
Coming in May from Greg Kofford Books, Adam Miller's Future Mormon, Essays in Mormon Theology. Every generation must work out their salvation. Every generation must live its own lives and think its own thoughts and receive its own revelations. And if Mormonism continues to matter, it will be because future generations, rather than leaving, were willing to be Mormon all over again. Like our grandparents, like our parents, and like us, they will have to rethink the whole tradition from top to bottom, right from the beginning, and make it their own in order to embody Christ anew in this passing world. Future Mormon will be available May 17th. See gregkofford.com for more details. I think this is actually a really good segue for a discussion on justice and compassion. Now, in your book, you refer to justice as a delusion. In fact, in the same chapter where you talked about the burning house. Can you expand a little bit more on the idea of the delusion of justice?
Okay. So, as I said, the burning house is a Buddhist metaphor for our reality. We're living in a house it's on fire, but because we think our house is our treasure, our place of safety, our home, we never suspect that we're in trouble. And it's only by being lured out of the house that we can, pass through the front door and glance over our shoulder and see that, in fact, there is smoke coming out of the windows. And so once we realize that we need to do something about our situation, we try to learn what is right and wrong. I mean, in the Mormon culture, we teach young children to choose the right, for example, and we try to gain a sense of judgment, which is all about justice. It's all about knowing what is right and wrong, and the way that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. But the problem with justice is that, I guess I shouldn't say that justice is the problem. It's the problem with our understanding of justice is that when justice delivers us at the gate to sorrow, we're surprised. And what I mean by that is that the more we understand justice and the more we understand right and wrong, the more refined our ideas become about what is acceptable and what is not. It creates a situation that we don't expect, a situation of sorrow in a couple ways. One is that, I don't know if you felt this or not, but I think that the more we become spiritually attuned to what is right and wrong, we realize how much we personally have to overcome and correct. In other words, the more refined our sense of judgment becomes, the more everything looks to be not good. And so I think that's a source of sorrow for me. It has been. Another one is, well, if you fight for equality, for example, or you try to level the playing field, as they say, and you try to search for a situation where everybody gets what they deserve, and you call that fairness. If you think about fairness, it's actually not very comforting, because if it is true that all of us are evil, and if it is true that we deserve punishment because of our evil nature, then that too is not a very happy scenario. Another case for sorrow. A third one is, although we might want to separate ourselves from things that we know are wrong, institutions that we know are evil, I think we're all implicated in the various ways in which society makes us members of various groups. So, for example, I might think that murdering people is a wrong thing, that it's evil. But to the extent that I am a citizen of the United States, my nation murders continuously. And we can think of many other situations where, although we might have certain principles, those principles are violated by our association with other people in groups. And then finally, I think another reason we sorrow is because as justice teaches us what is right and wrong, we want to teach our children and people we love the same things that we love. We want them to appreciate virtue and so on. But anyone who has had any experience with that realizes that it's not really easy to teach other people the things that you understand. And so, again, for those four reasons, and there could be many others, I think that justice leads us to sorrow. And the problem with that is that we didn't expect it to. And so rather than push through sorrow, as I think we're supposed to do, and to come out the other end of sorrow with a more compassionate view of reality, we turn away, we do a U-turn or a hard left turn, and we remain in a state of justice. And by doing so, we become critical or cynical or self-righteous, or you know what I'm talking about. People who think that if the end comes, they're going to be fine, but everybody else is going to be destroyed.
Sure. And this seems like a good segue into the topic of compassion, which, if I'm reading correctly, is Plan B.
Yeah. I think that I think that because I teach college students, I know that many of them have rejected the teachings of their parents, and at the same time, they tell me that what that doesn't mean is a lack of interest in spiritual matters. So then my question becomes, well, what is the spiritual matter that they want to stay attached to stay tuned to, even though they have rejected the sort of symbolic representation of that spiritual impulse? And what I'm trying to say is that I think that the rebellion that most of us go through, the questions that most of us finally entertain once we realize that the world is really a sorrowful place, I think that at that moment we have to do another turn. We have to first turn away from the burning house, but in our climbing toward the mountain, in our appreciation of righteousness, in our seeking for God, at some point we need to actually turn away to see the world in a different way. And I think for most people that's a very confusing notion, because we're taught to be obedient, we're taught to be faithful, we're taught to not question. But in fact, I think the various spiritual traditions that we can look at if we wish to are teaching us, in fact, that we're supposed to be making this turn. We're supposed to be encountering sorrow, which makes us ask these questions. So a good example would be, well, just give you a few that are very familiar with people. So Noah, when Noah gets off the boat and his feet hit ground, it doesn't seem like he's saying, "I made it, I did it, we did it, we're finally there." We read in Genesis that Noah made God promise him that he would never do that again. And so the rainbow is in the sky as a sign that God has made to Noah as a promise that what happened would never happen again. So the question is, why does Noah feel this way? Another example, very famous one, is Abraham. So Abraham learns that his wish to have a child is going to come true. He throws a party. God and his angels are there. He learns that they're on their way to Sodom and Gomorrah to destroy those cities. And his immediate response is not to say, yeah, I those guys really are not righteous. They do deserve destruction. His response is exactly the opposite. And he says, well, do you really want to do that? And he launches this argument based on fairness. He says, well, suppose there are 50 righteous people in those cities, will you still do it? And God says, no, I won't. And then Abraham, without being prompted, or as far as we can tell, lowers that number from 50 to 45 to 40 to 30 to 20 to 10. If there are 10 people who are righteous, will you spare the cities? And God agrees to this. And as we know, the cities get destroyed anyway. But my question is, why does Abraham care? Why does Abraham have this particular reaction to the punishment of these people for their unrighteousness? In other words, he's pushing back against justice because justice is making him sorrowful, and sorrowful is making him ask a question of God. And what happens in this situation is that Abraham himself changes his understanding of God so that he turns and he becomes like Jesus, someone who is in the middle. He takes a position of mediation and learns the nature of God by having this little tussle with God, and he re-understands sin and evil in a way that gives him compassion and allows him to condescend, to go back down to the burning house to save others. And that paradigm is all over in the various traditions that I studied. for Mormons, chapter 5 of Jacob is a familiar one, where the master of the orchard is going to burn down all the trees because they have not responded. And it's not the Lord of the vineyard, but the servant who works for the Lord in the vineyard, who steps forward at that point and says, let's give it one more shot. Let's try not to destroy the orchard. And I think that teaching of the end of the world is meant to prompt us to think about, well, what does the end of the world mean? What would the destruction of other people mean to us? And I think it's supposed to put us in a position where we're between God on the one hand and the world on the other, turn toward the world, not toward God, but toward the world, and then maybe back toward God in a position of supplication, where we ask forgiveness and we ask that the judgment not take place. And I think that's essentially the story of the end of the world. So the whole shebang is Plan B, and understanding just the first half of it, the justice part of it, is Plan A, the way we usually understand this teaching. And my argument is that if we continue to only understand half of this paradigm, then I think the world is actually in danger.
You actually say in your preface that you think the world will not end because of the so-called problem of evil, such as global warming or war or disease, but rather it's going to come about because of an often positive human sentiment. Can you tie this into what you were just discussing?
Yeah, there's an interesting way that people understand the end of the world. They usually say that the world is a bad place, the end is coming, it's not going to be pretty, but after the clouds of smoke dissipate, there'll be a few people standing, and among those will be me, me and my family, or me and my friends, or the people in my group who understand things correctly. And I think that's a very dangerous sentiment, because it excuses ourselves from doing anything about all the things that we think are going wrong. So before there is climate change, or the problem of climate change, there is the will to use or not use, carbon-based fuels. And we can talk about many other problems. Before there are thermonuclear weapons, there is the will to create them and use them. And my problem with justice is that people who think in terms of justice will often take the side of the justified and let the evil, the consequences of justice, which are not good, happen. So it sort of excuses us from doing things about the things that we sense are wrong. So in that sense, it's a positive idea, justice. Justice for all, peace and justice. Again, this is something that modern culture has made a goal, but justice is not a goal, really. It's an intermediate and maybe even a very early step in our progression toward a deeper understanding of the world and how we ought to take care of it.
Mormonism was really born as a millenarian tradition. The idea was that the Lord was coming, that the second coming was imminent, and there were debates between premillennialists and postmillennialists as to the role of justice and righting society's wrongs in preparation for the second coming, whether the Lord would come first and then correct all the wrongs, or whether we were meant to do that prior to the Lord's coming. And Mormonism seemed to kind of take both stances at different times, juggling both ideas. One example I can think of is the issue of slavery and abolition, where Mormons really didn't take an abolitionist stance institutionally anyway, because of this belief of the imminence of Christ's coming, and that slavery, although an evil institution, would be abolished after the millennial kingdom had arrived on earth. So what you're arguing, it seems to me, is a little bit more of a premillennialist position of that we do need to take care of these things in society in preparation for this transition, or even lowercase end times.
Right. Yes. That's a great example. When do we not respond to the Spirit that teaches us to love other people? I think that's really the question. And if justice is telling us not to respond to the need of other people, then I think we need to question justice, and we need to think of the end of the world in slightly different terms. In other words, the end of the world might be a capital E event, but whether it is or not, we know now that it already is a lowercase e event. That is to say, the world is ending for lots of people and a lot of animals and a lot of plants, and it's an ongoing process that happens around us, and we see it. We notice it happening. And when we notice it happening, we have to say to ourselves, is that the way it should be? Is that the way it has to be? Is that the way it naturally follows from the things that my neighbor did wrong? Or do we say that, no, it doesn't matter if we deserve to be punished or not, because we all deserve to be punished. That's not really the question. The question is, do we do something about the way the world is declining because we are suffering from the consequences of our actions, and doing something about the causes of those problems, I think, is actually something that we should be doing.
That was Charles Shirō Inouye, author of The End of the World Plan B, available now in paperback and ebook from Greg Kofford Books. Thank you for listening to the Kofford Books AuthorCast. You can subscribe to us on iTunes and Google Play, and be sure to like us on Facebook to receive the latest information about our authors, releases, and promotions.